Stephen, and I go to MIT as a math major, and I am the class of 2026. I'm from Chatham, New Jersey, class of 2022. And then throughout high school, while I did a lot of CS, I also put a lot of time into math competitions such as AMC, AME, USAMO, other competitions you may have heard of. And then to kind of bridge my passion for math with other areas, I also participated in the Regeneron ISEF Science Fair. And I was a finalist in 2020, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. All right, so what is ISEF? So it is the International Science and Engineering Fair, sponsored by Regeneron, and it was previously sponsored by Westinghouse. So if you kind of look online and you see projects for Westinghouse competition, it's the same thing, it was just rebranded. Yeah, so this is the largest international pre-college science competition. 1,800 high school students from 75 countries present their science projects. And then it's very inspiring to meet peers and leaders in your field to share your research and hear about other people's work, because seeing what other people do is the best way to grow and learn about anything. And so, yeah, just another incentive to kind of want to get there. There are some cash prizes, which are very nice. And there are also special awards, which have many other very nice perks. All right, so what are the project categories? What can you do a project in? So you can do animal sciences, behavioral and social sciences, biochem, biomedical, cellular and molecular biology. You can read through the rest of these, and this list should also be on the ISEF website if you're curious and want to look more into any one of these. And so my projects were always under the mathematics category, and typically each of these larger 21 categories would also have smaller subcategories. So for example, in math, there's algebra, analysis, combinatorics, geometry, number theory, probability, and any other type of math you would like to present a project on. All right, so how do you qualify for ISEF? So not anybody can just go and present a project. So since you can't enter it directly, you must compete in a Regeneron or ISEF affiliated science fair and win the right to attend ISEF. So you can find out the affiliated science fairs in your state and in other countries through this link. Take a screenshot of this if you would like to look into this, but then I'm pretty sure it's also pretty easy to find on the website. So for example, New Jersey, the state I'm from, has 3 local science fairs affiliated with ISEF, and I qualified through the North Jersey Research Science Fair, which has been rebranded to the Terra North Jersey STEM Fair in 2023. And this specific competition had the capacity to send 6 people to ISEF from the science fair each year. And so, yeah, these science fairs are typically open to anyone, and you don't need to qualify. So there's a question from Sonal in the chat. And so typically how these work is that the actual science fair won't be affiliated with any particular high school, but in order to participate in the science fair, you would need to register with your school. So you would typically have a science teacher from your school kind of sign off your forms and approve your entry into the competition. So even if it's not directly affiliated, all you need is one teacher to kind of just say, yep, this person has a valid project and they're good to enter. Yep, of course. All right. So once you start kind of looking into projects more deeply, one thing you'll notice is that it seems that a lot of projects have mentors, right? And it kind of seems, well, it's kind of difficult to find a mentor, right? But do I really need one? So you don't have to have a research mentor for a successful project. That's the clean-cut answer. And my experience actually did not involve one. And just overall, some projects do, some projects don't. It's nothing to really get too stressed about. But yeah, either way works. But one thing you must have is an adult sponsor to enter these affiliated science fairs. So this was kind of what I was touching on briefly with Sonal's question. You need to have an adult sponsor, which in my case was my chemistry teacher. But yeah, typically a science teacher from your high school would be more than happy to be your sponsor. But yeah, when more and more people get involved, this means that there's more paperwork and signatures required. So it's really important to be aware of your timeline, when everything is due, and what things need to get signed by when. And so if your high school doesn't have such a teacher, it's actually a good idea to start a club, like a research club. So I believe my sister, 3 years before me, started the club at my high school, which was very nice. So I didn't have to do it myself. But research clubs are a great way to kind of find other like-minded people within your school that are also interested in doing research. And through your club, it becomes a lot easier to find a teacher to be your adult sponsor. Yeah, and one thing just I would want to briefly mention is that if your project involves like real things, like I guess not real, but alive things like animals, if you're doing animal science, the amount of forms you have to do kind of grows by a lot. So if that's what you're interested in, it's just another thing you want to be aware of. All right, so I'll hand it off to Frances here.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about how specifically computer science is used across all of these different research projects in ISEF. So I looked into kind of a big overview, right, of all the different projects across all the different categories, and I found that there were a couple of main different applications of computer science that were used across all these projects. So firstly, data analytics. So this was pretty much present in almost all of the research projects to some extent, to kind of show what are your statistical results. Specifically, a lot of people used pandas in Python, which is a Python library, which you can use for graph plotting and data set manipulation. So this is a really helpful library if you wanted to do kind of any manipulation of data. Next, machine learning. So this was something I would say like had a fundamental concept that had different applications across almost all of the different categories. So for example, machine learning would be something that could be present in the physics category, but also chemistry or biology. And then the last three, I would say, are more sort of category specific. So they were definitely used in some categories more than others. So software platforms. So certain people maybe created apps or websites that they could have used for like user testing, as well as simulation or visualization. So visualizing chemical interactions or simulating different like kind of objects in physics, as well as microcontrollers and tools for data collection. So different sensors, for example, Arduinos, those seem to be used a lot more in engineering projects. So yeah. And then I kind of made a table sort of. So I took two projects from a couple of different categories, and I analyzed how they used different kind of these different computer science categories in each of them. So for example, here you can see in the behavioral/social sciences category, the Alzheimer's disease. This project, what it did was that, first of all, it used data analytics to, it was developing a new test that could see whether, sort of diagnose whether someone has Alzheimer's. And in this case, they did actually develop a software platform as well, which kind of served as an interface on a computer that a test, like a user testing kind of format, that a patient could use. And then as well as in terms of biomedical engineering. So for example, this one person developed this 3D printed wound dressing, because currently when you do traditional wound dressing, it's sort of it has a lot of room for error in terms of causing infections. So in this case, they did engineer a separate device. So that's what used the microcontroller. Yeah, next slide. yeah, so this is kind of going on to more categories. In this case, it's chemistry and computational biology. In chemistry, this one person used different chemical processes to convert CO2 into different green chemicals. So then in this case, they used a lot of simulation and visualization platforms, especially visualizing chemical interactions and chemical processes. And in computational biology, this definitely tended to be the most machine learning oriented kind of category. So both of these projects were using machine learning towards drug discovery or using other, just developing new like neural forms of neural networks. So yeah. And then as well as environmental engineering and mathematics. So for example, environmental engineering, there was definitely, again, a lot of kind of external devices or sensors that were used, as well as simulating and visualizing different kind of interactions between different chemicals. And then in mathematics, I would say, for example, here, there's like this one project about mathematical modeling to fight gerrymandering. And it used a lot of different software platforms. It incorporated a bit of machine learning, as well as like simulation and visualization. And then I guess lastly, just for this last category, so physics, the main project that actually won, I think, like this year's ISEF overall, was actually a physics project that was about using machine learning to detect these specific kinds of planets. So then that, of course, involved a lot of this. And then you can see that like all of these projects in general involved data analytics.
All right. Thank you, Francis. I thought that was very interesting. You know, there's a very broad categories of projects, but they all use CS. So another benefit to taking more classes at Create and Learn. So yeah, now I'll talk about my journey through my high school science fairs and how eventually I got to ISEF. So ninth grade was when I started my first project, and I didn't know much, but I did know is that what I didn't know is that I played soccer and I was a very big fan of Premier League games. So I wanted to do a project on soccer. So on Kaggle, which is a website that has lots of data sets, they had a data set on European soccer. And so there were 5,000 matches, 300 teams, 10,000 players, and 11 leagues. So this was like the different kind of data that I got. So for any kind of league, I would get the match ID, the home team ID, the away team ID, and then the amount of goals they scored in this game and the away team, the amount of goals the away team scored. So this chart on the left is kind of a way to represent one game in addition to the result of the game. And so for each API ID for each team, there are 11 players, which represent the 11 starting players in the game, and they each have an ID as well. And so now the third layer, which is this last chart on the right here, is the skill ratings for this player in different categories in soccer. So they would be rated 49 on crossing, 44 finishing, 71 heading accuracy, and so forth. And these ratings are out of 100. Yeah. So this was the data that I received, and I wanted to do a project on this. So as I was still quite young, I didn't do anything too advanced, but I just wanted to see, okay, based on the data that I received right here from the matches, the home teams, and the players, can I predict who would win in a match based on previous records? And so, not surprisingly, of course, it turns out that predicting winning and losing for soccer is quite difficult, right? Because if it was easy, then it wouldn't be interesting to watch. But there were a few interesting results I got after analyzing the data set. And the two kind of main things that I confirmed were home field advantage and an age advantage. So these two kind of terms are pretty prevalent if you follow any kind of sport, right? as a player tends to get older, they tend to perform worse, and teams at home tend to perform better than away from home. But these were kind of just statements that people make about sports in general, and I found some statistical evidence to back up these claims. So if we look at this chart here, right, we can see that being born earlier in the year means you're bigger, stronger, and have a higher chance of going pro, which is kind of strange, right? If you look at how look at the distribution of people being born throughout the year, right? Because it doesn't really make sense that there should be a bias towards the beginning of the year for more skilled players, right? But just to give a little tidbit about this, the reason it's like this is because at the youth levels, the division of players is done by calendar year. So people born at the beginning of the calendar year would be bigger and older than the younger people. So they would be able to perform better than the smaller kids. So that was the reason there's kind of this downward trend in the number of players based on birth month. All right, so I entered this project into my regional science fair in 2019, which was my local ISEF affiliated science fair. And yeah, I didn't win anything. My results and techniques were straightforward. A lot of the judges kind of thought my work was intuitive. And yeah, I did happen to miss a judging session due to a music audition, but despite all of this, I learned a great deal of kind of techniques that would be very useful to me later on. So I learned how to process data with Python. I learned how to deal with large spreadsheets. I learned how to make plots. I learned the kind of techniques that you need into making a good poster for presenting my project. And lastly, which I believe is the most important, I learned the kind of questions that judges will ask when presenting a project and the important questions to have an answer for before you even go into the room to present your project. So this was my first year. It wasn't very successful in terms of awards, but in terms of learning, I learned a lot. So next year, which is, I'm now in 10th grade, I really enjoyed working on soccer. So I decided to do a continuation of my project from last year. So now I obtained a different soccer data set from Stats, which is a sports analytics company. And this data set contains 7,500 pro game possessions. And each possession is a time series of 46 dimensional vectors of the X and Y coordinates of the 22 players involved. All right, so this second bullet here is quite, has lots of stuff going on. But what does this mean? If we look at this graph on the right of these blue dots and red dots and the black dot, essentially what I got was throughout a possession, so throughout the time series of one team having possession of the ball, I would get at every 0.1 seconds, I would get the locations of every player and I would get the location of the ball. So I received that data in a table like this on the left. And the first thing I did was turn this kind of table with lots of numbers and coordinates into a graph where you could visually see the progression of the possession over each 0.1 seconds when every player's coordinate was updated. So this was the new data set I was dealing with, but it was still soccer. It was still something that I was interested in and something I was interested in finding a new result in. So there were kind of three main parts of this. So the first thing I wanted to do was, with these 7,500 possessions, a few of them ended in a goal and a lot of them ended in no goal. So I wanted to see, okay, was there any statistical difference I could find between the possessions that ended a goal and those that didn't, based on the coordinates of the players in the ball? Like, can I make a claim that I'm decently sure is true? And the second part of the project involved another question I I was playing on my high school soccer team at the time, and I wanted to see, okay, these pro players are so good, but why are the people on my team, why is my high school team, why are none of the people here pro? So I wanted to see, can I determine statistical differences between my team and the pro team? So the first issue with trying to do this comparison is that I don't have a data set for my high school team. This data set I received from stats, which is the coordinates of the players and the ball throughout the possessions. I only have that for the pro players. I don't have that for my high school team. So what I needed to do first was I needed to take videos of my high school game. I had my dad in the stands take videos, and the first thing I had to do was geometrically project the coordinates of the players on the phone screen in the video and turn those into coordinates on the field so I can recreate the data set I got for the pro players. And yeah, once I have the two data sets, I can actually compare the players and see if there's a difference. And just for like a brief summary of what the difference was, if you're interested, is that pro players tend to run more where the ball will be in a few seconds. And my high school team and other amateur players in general would just run to the current location of the ball. So this was a slight difference I found based on the movement vectors of pro and student players. Yeah, so now let's talk about how this performed in the competitions. So this project was in 2020. So unfortunately, due to COVID, this process became remote. So instead of a poster board, I made slides and a video for a 12-minute presentation. And I won first place in the math category at my regional fair, and I was one of the 6 people to win the ISEF grand prize, which was very nice. And so I was selected in this regional competition to go to ISEF to present my project. And so it seems that judges liked my projective geometry and statistical findings. And one thing I will have to admit is that I think the NJRSF 2020 competition didn't have many strong math projects, which made my project stand out even more. So unfortunately, no matter kind of how much effort you put into your project, there is somewhat of a luck element into the strength of the other projects in your category. Yeah, and ISEF 2020 had an online celebration and no competition. So unfortunately, I couldn't present my project to new judges, but it was in an online celebration where I got to talk to many other people, which was still very fun. So yeah, these first 2 years, I didn't have a mentor, but because of the success of this project, I won a special award at my regional science fair, which allowed me to connect with my mentor, Dr. Mohajari, for my next endeavor. All right, so now moving on to 11th grade. So I decided that I had been successful with my soccer project and I wanted to do something new. I was interested in math at the time, but I hadn't really ever done any pure math, so to speak. So with my mentor, Dr. Mohajari, we talked about graph theory and what kind of interesting questions there are that are still open that I could do some research on. And the problem I worked on was called sum edge coloring. So I won't try and define this problem because it's quite involved mathematically, but I will talk about a similar problem because it's one that you may have heard of. So if you have heard of the 4-color problem, it's quite similar to the project I did in 11th grade. So let me state this question now. So if you're given a map of the US and someone asks you to color each of the states in the map of the US so that any 2 states that are touching, they will be different colors. So the question becomes, what's the minimum amount of colors you can use to color this map of the United States, right? So if we look at a simpler example, right? So if we just have two objects and they're touching, we can color like this new graph with two colors, right? So the left object could be red and the right object could be blue. So yeah, that's a simple example. And it turns out that any kind of map can be colored with four colors, which is kind of interesting. And this is a famous problem, and my problem is mathematically similar in a sense to this question. So my solutions, again, are quite mathematically involved, so I won't talk about them too much, but I computed an optimal solution for summation coloring on multi-trees, which are a graph with a simpler structure as opposed to a general graph. And I proved that optimal solutions are hard to compute efficiently on bipartite graphs, which is another type of graph, which is more complex than a multi-tree, but still not a general graph. So this project, while it seems a lot more complex and seems a lot more involved than my project in 9th and 10th grade, I only won the third prize in the math category at my regional fair in comparison to my first place with my soccer project. And I have a few kind of possibilities in mind as to why this is the case. And the first is because 2021, the math projects were a lot better, right? So this goes back to what I was saying. So in 2020, it seems there weren't many math projects in general, but 2021, everybody had a really good project, really interesting results. And unfortunately, mine was deemed not as good, which is okay. But that's just the nature of the competition. And in addition, I think during my soccer project, because it was something that I pursued independently out of my own interest, there's a good chance that my passion was shown better throughout my presentation and through my question answering from the judges, which they may have liked, and could be another reason as to why I did so well. Yeah, but this was my second project. And now I'm going to talk about a few tips that I learned and some tidbits to help you get started on your own project if you're struggling to get started. So the most important part is to find a project, right? If you don't have a project, you can't present, and so on. So it's important to not only find a project, but find a good project. So you want to find an area that excites you, right? That was one of my predictions as to why my first project did better than my second. It's because I believe that the soccer one just excited me more, and that was shown more to the judges. So Kaggle is a great source of interesting data sets if you're not sure where to start. That's where I got my data set from my 9th grade project, which got me started. But they have many, many data sets out there. They have kind of, I guess one interesting thing I remember seeing recently on this website was talking about how do different conditions affect people's standardized test scores. So like SAT scores, what are the kind of factors that go into impacting a student's SAT scores? I think it's kind of interesting. And there's lots of machine learning in many successful projects. For example, medical diagnosis, weapon detection in airport luggage scan, and irrigation in farming. There's lots of machine learning in many successful projects. So if you're interested, doing a project is a great way to kind of have an introduction to not only learning machine learning, but also figuring out how to apply it to something real. So another common thing you will notice if you go to one of these fairs is that projects that have an obvious societal impact have an edge in winning. But I personally believe it's more important to be passionate about your project first. I think one example I would like to mention of this is that I saw a project that was about dealing with road rage, right? So It was trying to determine, is road rage real? And obviously there's a societal impact, right? It's keeping roads safe and saving lives. But I thought there was a key issue with this project that the judges didn't seem to pick up on, which was that how the person formed the experiments for this project was that they told the people driving that there would be a camera in their car to kind of monitor how they drove, right? So I think that's very unrealistic, because if I was driving and I had a camera in the back of my car, I wouldn't drive with I wouldn't drive the same way I normally would, right? I'd be aware that my driving is being used in an experiment. I'd be safer, right? Not saying that I drive unsafely to begin with, but just being aware of having a camera watching you drive would obviously affect many things. So even though there was kind of this big flaw, because there was a societal impact with this project, the judges seemed to really like it, and the person did very well. And yeah, I don't want to kind of talk badly about this person's project. There were many other interesting parts, but I just wanted to mention societal impact is a good way to kind of progress your project in terms of maybe performing better if you're unsatisfied with how you previously performed. And yeah, if you're still struggling for a topic, there's nothing on Kaggle you don't see any way to apply machine learning, it's always nice to brainstorm with your peers, teachers, parents, siblings, and maybe senior students from your high school that had already gone through the science fair process. And yeah, this is another bullet that kind of brings up this idea of maybe starting a club at your school, right? So if you have a club, that's peers right there for you to discuss your project with. And lastly, you can always go through science fair websites for previous years to find previous projects. Yeah, so Dylan asks, is this for secondary and elementary schools too? So ISEF is specifically a high school competition with high school affiliated competitions, but I believe there are middle school competitions as well for younger students, which can be a great way to practice and a great way to get into research before you enter high school so you can be better prepared. So yeah, unfortunately, this is not for elementary schools, but there are elementary school and middle school competitions out there that you can participate in. Yeah. And lastly, some people suggest reaching out to professors. I didn't try that, but I know that this involves a lot of work. You need to email a lot of professors. You need to email out to a lot of professors to maybe get a response. So Orion asks, what about after? I'm not sure, Orion, what are you referring to? All right. Yeah, just message in the chat whenever you have your question. I'll come back to it. All right. So a few more tips. So in high school, you're going to be very busy. So a question I get asked is how to find time for research. And so I think something that really helped me was to get started in the summer, right? Because starting is always the hardest part, to find a good project. And when you're really busy in high school and you don't have a project, you're always going to find excuses to push it off. Oh, I'll do it later and later. But if you kind of get started in the summer, get your project set in stone, you'll be able to have momentum going into the year, and you'll have concrete stuff to work on, which is a lot easier than sitting there brainstorming when you could be doing other things for high school. And so, yeah, once the year rolls around, it's important to kind of schedule your time, set aside a few hours each week. For example, say every Saturday afternoon, I'll work on this project and do X, Y, Z. And again, be aware of deadlines. A lot of the smaller affiliated ISEF competitions, they can have confusing websites. So it's important to be on top of everything. And yeah, never be afraid to email out to the competition organizer to clarify anything if you're unsure. Yeah, so just some tips on how to make a good presentation. So it's important to assume that your audience is highly intelligent, but don't assume that they have background in your project area. So your judges typically will be specified to your specific project category, but they may not be familiar in your subcategory, right? So you can assume that they can pick up ideas relatively quickly, but don't assume that they know what your research question is beforehand, right? Don't assume that they understand what that means because they may have never even thought about this subcategory before, which is not a bad thing, but it just means that you need to cater to them. You need to make sure that they understand what's going on. And so following along with this, it's really important to spend time on the problem description before getting into the technical details. Because when working on a project, right, once you have your question, right, you're going to spend a lot of time looking for results and doing all this interesting work, right? But so to you, that would be the most interesting part to you. But when presenting a project to a judge, if they don't understand the question that you think is interesting, they're not going to understand any of the interesting results that you have either. So it's really, really important that you make sure your judge understands the question you're asking before you go into the technical details. Because if you start going into the details, they're not going to be able to follow your project at all. And so another thing is to make sure you have a clear purpose for each slide. Make sure to have a header and make sure there's a logical flow throughout your project. It's not just a bunch of slides randomly put together. It's like you're almost telling a story throughout your poster. And it's also nice to ask a question to lead a topic, right? So for example, in my soccer project, instead of saying, I looked at the difference between goal scoring and non-goal scoring possessions. If I ask it in a question like, do goal scoring and non-goal scoring possessions have different properties? It kind of leads your thoughts to mimic how you thought about this question when you're actually doing your research, right? It makes the flow seem more natural and is more interesting to the judges. All right, before I continue, there's a question from Dylan. Can you work in groups or is this just a one-person project? So I did both of my projects on my own, but there are group projects. I believe that most competitions will limit you to 2 people in a project, but that I imagine varies. So make sure to kind of look at your specific competition's website to find the regulations for how many people you are allowed to have in a project. Yeah, good question. Yeah, and it's also really important, going back to what makes a good presentation, that you time your practice talk. So if you've been working on a project for months, right, I imagine you could talk about your project, what you did and your results for many hours, but oftentimes for each judge, you only have at most maybe 10 or 11 minutes to talk about your entire project. So you want to make sure that you really explain your project details and you don't want to get bogged down in the tiny things. So it's essentially you want to make sure that everything is covered and everything kind of makes sense within the time limit that you're given to present your project. And if you're having trouble with this, you can make a script if necessary. It won't harm you in any way. Just make sure that if you're in person, you're not staring down at the piece of paper when the person is trying to talk to you, right? You can use a script to give you an outline to make sure you don't get lost on the way, but don't ever just read from a paper. You want to have your talk with the judges seem like a conversation. And lastly, you want to practice your talk with peers, teachers, neighbors, family members, and answer their questions, because the more people you talk to, the more perspectives you're going to see, which will help you prepare talking to the judges even more. All right, so now let's talk about a few common questions that you'll get from judges. These are typically questions that you'll get from judges that aren't too well versed with your project, but they still want to kind of see what your thought process was. They'll commonly ask you what was the most challenging aspect of your project, and similarly, what was your favorite aspect of the project? So I think that's a question that you should definitely have an answer to before you get to the competition. That's something I can almost guarantee you at least one judge will ask you. Oftentimes you'll be asked, how did you get interested in this project? What kind of help did you receive from other people? And now going along with that, if you were in a lab or had a mentor for your project, they'll ask you, okay, what did you specifically contribute to this project? Right, because obviously as a high school student, you're not going to have access to an entire lab on your own. So they want to know, okay, what did you do if you were working with a mentor? And so if they are kind of well-versed in your project topic, they might mention something, might mention a similar problem. So if they've seen some XXX technique for this problem, how is your technique different from the technique that they're familiar with? And then a follow-up question to this is, can your results be applied to the technique that they were aware of? And they might ask you to explain some part of your project in more detail. And they might ask, okay, what if you did this instead of this? And these last two questions are oftentimes what you'll be asked as a last question. They'll ask, okay, what is the impact of your work? What are the applications if your work is very theoretical? And they'll ask you, what is the next step for your project? So I think it's very important to always answer these questions as if you're going to continue working on your project after the competition. Whether or not you are, it's nice to have that positive attitude, as in you're still interested in researching more into the project and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, the last few things is that these competitions are very subjective. Don't ever take anything personally. It's a lot of stuff comes down to chance, but it always helps not miss any judging sessions, like I did one time. But I recovered, so it wasn't too big of a deal. But yeah, these competitions, while winning is nice, it's hard to guarantee that because they are very subjective. And yeah, so this is the end of what I have presented. So in these last few minutes, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure me and Frances would both be more than happy to answer. So yeah, going back to Orion's question, I'm still not sure what they meant, but if it was about after middle school or high school. So after middle school, you have your high school competitions now. So, which is what I'm talking about. So ISEF and these regional things are all high school competitions. And then after high school, you kind of have entered the real world of research because that's when you can start going to universities doing real research with professors. So there are not really any kind of well-formed competitions after high school. So I'm not sure if that's what you're asking about, but yeah, let me know if it was something else.
All right, so before we get more questions, and thank you so much, Stephen, for the presentation. Definitely sharing your own experiences. Not only that, there's a lot of really quite sophisticated math and computer science that you did, but also the persistence of doing it every year when you were in high school. It just takes a lot of passion. And then the tips are great as well. While you were presenting it, I was almost thinking that as you guys participate in the science fairs, we all, by the way, we're recording this video, so we're going to put it on YouTube. you might want to go back to Stephen's presentation at different stages of your fair and just kind of review it again. I feel like there's some really awesome tips. So as the next part of it is we're going to open up for more questions. You can either have your questions put in chat or you can raise your hand. There is a reaction thing in Zoom. You can just raise your hand and then we'll see it. We can open up the audio. I'm new to you, so you can ask your question in audio as well. Before that, I'm actually going to have Frances do a quick sharing of her screen of the Society of Science website. I think a lot of times that, when people are getting super familiar with it, you would know what site is, but if you're new for ISEF, this might be helpful. So maybe just walk with people the site a little bit, and then while you guys are queuing up your questions and raise your hand to get your question ready as well. So go ahead, Frances.
Yeah, let me share my screen. So this is the homepage for the Society for Science website. And in here, you can see that there's like this science competitions tab. So then this like smaller sub tab specifically is ISEF. And then this is like the junior middle school version. So I guess it's called the Thermo Fisher Scientific Junior Innovators Challenge. And then, so if you go to the ISEF, so this is the ISEF page. So here's where they have like a bunch of their kind of information. So for example, you have like your find a fair resources, your different guidelines, your project guidelines, different questions, as well as the categories, subcategories. And then if you go up here to the virtual fair, then this is where you can actually like view all of the different projects. So you can go to this virtual fair website, and then if you click Explore 2023 projects, then here you can see all of these different categories for the ISEF projects, as well as the subcategories and different awards, for example, and these are each of their projects. So for example, if I was to like click on this one, then you get the abstract, you get the team members, and then you get their like kind of their quad chart, as well as their presentation, their video, and some other stuff. So that's ISEF. And then for the junior innovators, this is the page that you get from the Society of Science homepage. And then this is like information on how you can compete as well. So yeah, that's just like a very quick, I guess, introduction to the website and how to find everything on there.
Yeah, let's go ahead and let's see if I have any questions. I think, Stephen, there are several questions in the chat. You want to go pick them up and ask them?
Yeah, so I think Sonal had the most recent question. So when is Intel Science Fair held? Do students often use the same project as in the regional fair? Yeah, so I think, I'm not sure if it is required, but it is almost everybody does the same project from the regional to the international fair, because the idea is that your project was interesting, so they want to raise it to the next level, right? So they don't want to have everybody scrambling to do a new project by the time the international one comes around. So I think my timeline, I don't exactly remember it, but I started working in the summer, and then the regional fair was in like the early next year, so like January, February, around then. And then the Intel Science Fair, I'm not sure when it usually is because mine was online, but it either starts pushing towards the end of the year and into summer, so that kind of time. So I hope that answers your question. Moving on to what Dylan has asked, in many projects I've done, I fell behind schedule. What can I do to prevent this? Yeah, so this is a really good question. It's something I think everybody who does a project kind of experiences. I think it's really important to break down your project into smaller parts, because if you have a really large task ahead of you, it can be very intimidating and you don't know where to start. and that is what causes you to fall behind. So if you kind of break that larger task into a bunch of smaller sections, even if you're not staying exactly on schedule, you can be guaranteeing that you're making progress to your larger goal. So yeah, I think that's kind of, in my experience, the main reason as to why things fall behind. But let me know if there's any other thing. Yeah. So these create and learn questions, I'll leave to Jesse to answer. Henry asked, do you guys offer any machine learning class? And yeah. So now Dylan's asking, how long did you spend in hours making your project? I'm not entirely sure in terms of hours. I think I definitely spent a long period of time overall working on it. I think I started like in the middle of the summer, went all the way through the beginning of next year. So 6 months was kind of my overall timeline for the project. I'm not sure how long in hours, but I think it's definitely more important to kind of spread the project across a long period of time rather than trying to pack it in too many hours. Because if you try and cram it into a small period of time, doing lots of hours in a small sitting, right? You don't give your brain time to kind of absorb the ideas and be creative, right? Creativity comes with time, and that's not something that happens just with pure hours working on your research. Oftentimes, the most insightful ideas you'll have are just from doing something else, and then randomly you think, oh, I could actually approach this problem this way instead of this way, and that will be your project. So doing a project, there's a lot of hands-on technical stuff, but then there's also a lot of just sitting around and thinking, and a lot of ideas will come to you over time. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a specific figure in hours for my project, but that's kind of my thoughts on how long my project took. So if I wanted to kind of show off, I could say that I was working on it all the time throughout these 6 months because I was always thinking about it on and off, but that's not really how it works. There's kind of, you're always have this in the back of your mind if it's a large project that you're working on. Alex asks, do they only allow individual projects in a group project? At least based on my understanding, there are group projects of definitely 2 people is allowed. I'm not sure about more than 2 people, but 2 people should be allowed for a group project.
All right, very cool. Well, we're running out of time. So maybe I'll wrap it up with one more question. If anyone else has a question, you can put in the chat as well. So Stephen, you actually mentioned this in your presentation previously, but one of the things that people learn today, and they're probably thinking, where do I get started? I don't exactly know where do I do. I mean, it's obviously important to just start with something, and over the year, you're going to build more. Do you want to just give people, like, kind of bring up the suggestions of how to get started again?
Yeah, let me go back to that. So I think the best concrete place to look for a starting point is a website I'm going to put in the chat. It's kaggle.com/datasets, which provides you with datasets for basically any topic. There's like cancer research, there's large language models like ChatGPT, that kind of stuff. It's very, very broad. I highly suggest just looking through this website and seeing if there's any topic that interests you. You don't necessarily have to use one of these data sets, but because it's so broad, I think it's very good for providing a starting point if you're not sure on where to look for a project.
Yeah. as Steven saying that this site has everything, like it probably have travel information, weather information, soccer, as you said, and movies and novels and books and Netflix videos. So regardless of what area that you're interested, there are some data sets in there, and that's always an area to get a great area to get started. Of course, if you have something you're passionate about, or if it's a social impactful areas that you are excited about, that's a great place to start as well. I think Stephen mentioned that also, the important aspect of having a social impact. Great. Well, with that, we're going to finish up today. Thank you so much for Stephen and Frances' presentation today. Thanks everyone for joining and all the great questions. I do hope everyone going to go back and tries to do some interesting science project. And then a lot of the codings will be involved. But regardless which area that you're working on, I'm sure you'll have a lot of fun. All right.
Yep. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Bye.
No, didn't.